Hannah Whitaker didn't see Trent Halford until his hand snapped around her wrist. 1 second she was in a glittering Tribeca penthouse, pretending she belonged among champagne flutes and designer smiles. The next, she was being dragged toward the balcony like she was property. "You really thought you could walk away from me?" he hissed, pulling her closer. Hannah tried to wrench free. Trent let go. He only tightened his grip, then fisted his fingers in her hair and yanked once, hard enough to steal her breath. And the room did what it always did. It watched. It looked away. It stayed silent. A glass touched down at the bar with a soft, final sound. A man Hannah had never seen set his drink aside and started walking toward them. Unhurried, unstoppable. He didn't shout. He didn't run. He simply adjusted his jacket as he came close just enough for Trent's face to drain of color. "Let her go," the man said. Trent's swagger cracked. "Mind your business." The man didn't blink. "You've made her my business." Then he looked straight at Hannah and spoke her name like he'd been watching her long before tonight. "Go home, Hannah." She didn't know who he was. She only knew Trent finally loosened his hand because he knew exactly who the man was. Like what you're hearing. Tap like. Share it with someone who loves high-stakes drama. Subscribe to our channel so you won't miss the next twist. Hannah left the penthouse like someone who'd just stumbled out of a storm. Nobody was willing to admit had happened, her ears still ringing with the music. But what haunted her most wasn't the noise. It was the silence at the exact moment she was forced toward the railing. The complicity of a room that preferred the comfort of its champagne to the safety of a guest. The Tribeca night wind slapped her face, turning her cheeks numb with cold. Her scalp still burned with the ghost of his grip. She lifted a hand to touch it gently, reminding herself to breathe, to keep moving, to get away from that place before her knees gave out. Madeline chased after her all the way into the hallway, eyes rimmed red, hands shaking as she clung to Hannah's wrist, like she was afraid Hannah might vanish right in the middle of the crowd, stammering apology after apology, saying she didn't know Trent would come, saying she'd tried, saying everything had happened too fast. Hannah looked at Madeline with a heart that felt both tender and painfully small, because she understood what it was to be trapped inside someone else's fear, and she understood how people who lived off reputation would choose silence to protect a party, rather than protect a girl who had been so publicly violated. Hannah didn't blame Madeline out loud. She only shook her head, her voice rough from holding so much back, and said she needed to go home, needed to close the door, needed to sit down alone somewhere no one would look at her like she was entertainment. Madeline glanced toward the living room blazing behind the door, then lowered her voice as if begging, asking whether she should call the police, but the question died on her lips when she saw a few famous faces from media and finance gathered around the bar, and Hannah understood. Madeline was more afraid of scandal than she was of Trent, more afraid of a headline than she was of the brute force that had just shattered her safety. Hannah only said one small thing, that if Madeline called the police, her name would be on the front of something tomorrow, and if she didn't call, Hannah's name would be carved into her own memory tonight like a knife. She turned away before the tears could fall, because she didn't want to cry here, didn't want to give anyone the moment of seeing her break and then retelling it later as a story over lunch. Down below, the city was still bright. Traffic still surged as if nothing had happened. And Hannah called a car, slid close against the seat, pulled her coat up to cover half her face, and tried to make herself smaller the way survival had taught her to do. In the rearview mirror, streetlights stretched into long streaks. Her heartbeat began to slow, and then it snapped upright when she realized a black sedan was holding the same distance behind them, not close enough to draw attention, not far enough to lose her, like a shadow that knew how to calculate. Hannah's throat went dry. Her hands tightened around her purse, her mind racing through every route she'd changed over the past 3 months, every turn she'd used to shake a tail, every time she'd thought she'd gotten free. Trent. She thought of Trent immediately, of the smile at her ear, of the words he'd spoken as if stamping ownership, and fear twisted her stomach. She told the driver to turn onto another street, then turn again, deliberately taking the long way. But the sedan stayed there, calm as if it had predicted every choice she'd make. Hannah told herself it might be coincidence, just a car going the same way, but the instinct of someone who'd learned to live on alert wouldn't let her rest. She texted Madeline a short line that she was home, even though she wasn't, because she was afraid that if she disappeared from anyone's screen, Trent would win another step. When the car stopped in front of her apartment building, Hannah got out fast, eyes sweeping the street. Hannah focused on the steady click of her heels against the marble floor to drown out her own fear. The sedan stopped across from them, not moving closer. A door opened, and a tall man stepped out, unhurried, not trying to hide, wearing a dark coat, standing like someone used to making space move out of his way. Hannah stepped back on instinct, her spine hitting the cold wall, her voice going rigid as she asked who he was. The man didn't come closer. He only held up an identification card, the streetlight sliding across the printed letters, and his name was Miles Keating. In an even voice, without threat, he said he'd been authorized to make sure she got back safely. The word authorized felt like a physical weight, settling heavily on her shoulders. She asked who had authorized it. Keating looked at her as if weighing every word, and then he only said, "Mr. Sloan." The name dropped like a stone, because Hannah still remembered the man's face in the penthouse, the way he didn't need to fight for anything, only step forward, and the whole room had changed. Hannah forced air back into her lungs and said she didn't need anyone following her. She only wanted to go upstairs, lock the door, forget tonight. Keating didn't smile, didn't push, didn't reach to touch her. He only tilted his head slightly, like someone offering the only choice left, and said, "Don't go upstairs tonight." Hannah snapped back at once, asking why, asking if Trent was up there, asking what else was happening that she didn't know. But Keating only answered that he couldn't explain it here, not to be mysterious, but for safety. Hannah stood at the entrance, staring at the glass that reflected her own pale face, and suddenly realized her body felt like a frayed wire. Right then, the elevator doors opened behind her with a soft chime, like an invitation upstairs, like a familiar trap. The phone in Hannah's hand buzzed, the screen flaring bright in the dark, and a message from an unknown number appeared. A single line, cold and final. "Don't go home tonight." Hannah couldn't remember how she'd ended up stepping into Keating's car. She only remembered the moment her phone lit up with the icy words, "Don't go home tonight," and the sound of the elevator opening behind her that raised goosebumps on her skin, as if someone were standing inside, waiting. Keating didn't rush her, but he didn't give her a chance to stay still either. He opened the car door with a kind of politeness that couldn't be refused, and Hannah got in because the fear that outweighed her pride in that moment was the thought of going back to her apartment and finding that Trent had managed to worm his way inside. The car rolled through a Manhattan blazing with lights, buildings sliding past like giant walls that didn't care at all about one girl trying to keep herself from breaking apart. Hannah sat silent, both hands locked around her purse, eyes fixed on the window as if staring long enough could make everything normal again. Keating didn't talk. He didn't ask if she was okay. His silence felt like a wall, protective in exactly the right way, so she didn't have to answer anything while her throat was clenched tight. They stopped in front of a hotel that was luxurious without being loud about it. Warm, amber light, glass so clean it reflected her exhausted face with painful clarity. Keating took her up in a private elevator. No crowd, no music, only the hard, fast beat of her heart inside her chest. At the door, Keating scanned a key card, opened it, then stepped aside like a gatekeeper. He didn't enter. He didn't touch her. He only placed himself in the precise spot where anyone trying to reach her would have to go through him first. Hannah froze at the threshold, the old feeling of being cornered rising in her throat. She looked at the tidy room, the white bed, the window facing the river, and a panicked question flared in her mind. Was this another trap? Had she escaped Trent only to fall into the hands of a stranger? She turned back, ready to say she didn't need anyone standing guard, that she could lock the door herself, but Keating only set a thin envelope on the table by the entrance, as if he'd predicted her reaction. His voice stayed even, clear. "You can call a lawyer right now, if you'd rather hear it from someone else than from me." Inside the envelope was a business card, the name Sienna Hart, printed in bold, a phone number, and a small line about victim support and protective orders. Beside it was a short handwritten note, plain, not pretty, more like a safety procedure. "Don't go home. Don't answer unknown numbers. Don't post on social media. If you see someone following you, call this number immediately." Hannah picked up the card, her fingers trembling slightly, feeling like she was being pulled into a story that didn't belong to her, but at least this wasn't Trent's threats. It wasn't the crowd's silence. This was a door opening onto something she'd never planned for. Legal strategy. The door eased shut behind her, but Keating remained outside. He didn't lock her in. He occupied the space by the door, an immovable anchor in her chaotic night. Hannah leaned her back against the wall, let her purse drop to the floor, And right then her phone buzzed again. An incoming call. Unknown number. No name. She hesitated for a beat, then answered in a rough voice. Hello. The voice on the other end didn't offer a long greeting. It was a man's voice. Low, steady, so calm it made you listen. Hannah Whitaker. She stopped breathing, because only predators said her name like that, like stamping a claim. But this voice didn't sound like Trent. It didn't have drunkenness. It didn't have pleasure. It sounded like an iron door shutting to keep danger out. I'm Graham Sloan. You don't need to thank me. You just need to listen carefully. Hannah tightened her grip on the phone, the image flashing in her mind of the man who'd made Trent go pale, with nothing more than the motion of adjusting his coat. She asked what he wanted, and the question came out weaker than she meant it to. Graham didn't circle around it. Trent Halford owes the Calder Syndicate. He owes more than he can pay, and when a man like him gets desperate, he'll use the only thing he thinks belongs to him to buy time. Hannah's throat closed as if she'd known the next sentence would be a knife. Graham went on. He gave them your information as collateral. Not so they'd hurt you right away, but so they'd believe he still had something valuable to bargain with. That he still controlled you. The walls of the hotel room seemed to tilt. Hannah shook her head on instinct, saying it couldn't be true, but Graham answered with brutal simplicity. I know. I agree. And that's why I stepped in before they could lay a hand on you. Hannah swallowed, asked how he had stepped in, and Graham's voice didn't change. I bought the contract, not to own you, but to cut off the road that made you a target they could take. Hannah went silent. Part of her wanted to scream that no one had the right to buy anything connected to her, but another part of her felt ice spread through her as she realized this world really did have contracts where her name could sit like a dead line of text. Tears spilled before she could wipe them away. She spoke like a whisper. Graham paused for a beat, then said, You're a person who's being entangled in a ruthless game. I'm not going to let you get crushed because of someone else's fault. But from now on, until I'm sure Calder has no way to reach you, you won't move alone. The last sentence fell like a verdict. Until I'm sure you're safe, you don't move alone. Hannah closed her eyes, the humiliation from the party still burning under her skin. And now it turned into something deeper, a new shame, the shame of being turned into something that could be traded. She opened her eyes and looked out the window at the distant glitter of the city lights. And for the first time that night, she understood that the most terrifying thing wasn't that Trent had found her. It was that there was an entire world behind Trent that now knew she existed. The next morning, Hannah left the hotel with the feeling she'd slept inside a glass box set in the middle of a public square, safe but visible, even though no one had touched her. No one had asked how she was. Keating remained at a professional distance, his presence a silent warning to the world outside. Graham didn't appear. He didn't send another message to explain anything, and that absence made Hannah feel both angry and unmoored, because if this was a rescue, there should have been a reassuring sentence, and if this was an arrest, there should have been a threat, but instead there were only rules and silence, like an invisible contract. The car carried them through Manhattan's morning streets, where people drank coffee, wheeled suitcases, talked business as if last night had never existed, and Hannah watched those ordinary faces and felt like someone who'd stepped out of a different room in the world, a room where a girl could be dragged by her hair under chandeliers and then abandoned. When the car turned toward the river, glass towers rose high and reflected the blue sky, and Hannah realized they were approaching a luxury tower, a wide lobby, security staff standing like statues, everything polished to a shine that didn't allow for a dirty footprint. Keating led her through a private door, into an elevator that went straight to the upper floors. No public buttons, only a key card and a clean, clipped beep. The doors opened, and Hannah walked into Graham Sloan's penthouse, like she was walking into a vault, decorated in cold minimalism. Neutral walls, smooth stone surfaces, lighting calculated to be just right, not too warm, not too cold, exactly like a place designed to keep secrets, rather than to live. There were no family photos, no random objects, nothing that told a story about a human being. Only a perfection that made you lower your voice without thinking. Hannah heard her own footsteps on the floor, her heart pounding with a thought that wouldn't leave, that this wasn't the shelter of an ordinary man. It was a fortress. Keating brought her to a door on the left, opened it, and Hannah froze when she saw the room was ready, as if she'd been part of its schedule for a long time. The bed neat, the blanket soft, a set of clothes laid on a chair in the right size. Not so new it felt suspicious, but knew enough to prove someone had been watching. In the bathroom were shampoo and body wash in the scent she used to buy. That light scent she still chose because it didn't trigger memories of Trent. A robe in the exact color she often wore. A box of herbal tea she'd once purchased from the shop near her place. Gratitude flickered through her like a small beam of light, then was swallowed immediately by a shiver. By the simple truth that someone knew what she liked, knew what she needed, even knew the smell that made her feel safe. And Hannah no longer knew where the line was between protection and surveillance. Keating said in a voice without emotion, "This is your room. If you need anything, say so." And then he left, leaving Hannah alone in a quiet that cost too much. She set her bag down, walked slowly into the living room, and through the wall of glass, she saw the city spread beneath her like a map, beautiful to the point of being unreal, and she wondered whether from up here, her fear looked as small as a speck of dust. Right then, Graham stepped out from another door. Not loud, not startling, as if he'd always been there and simply hadn't wanted to take up her space with his presence. He was dressed simply, no suit, no shine, but his presence still felt like last night, still and heavy like a steel door. Hannah looked at him, her throat tightening, questions surging like floodwater. Why he knew her name, why he dared to buy anything connected to her, why he appeared at the exact moment and then disappeared, why the entire silent party room obeyed him. Graham didn't dodge it. He said they'd stay here for a short time until things were clear. Then he laid out rules like reading off a mandatory list. No social media, no posting locations, no contact with Trent, no answering unknown numbers, no going out alone. If she needed to go out, she had to tell Keating and have someone with her. If she felt unsafe, she should call Sienna Hart, his lawyer. Hannah heard each sentence like another lock being slid onto the door of her life, and she gave a thin smile. The only difference being this one was cleaner, more polite, and backed by more reasonable logic. She stepped closer and looked Graham straight in the eye, her voice rough but firm. "You saved me or you contained me." Graham didn't look away. He didn't get defensive. He only answered calmly, like stating an uncomfortable fact he had no interest in softening. "Both, until the threat is gone." Hannah felt a sharp pain in her chest, because that wasn't a promise. It was a condition, and that condition made her feel like a temporary resident inside her own life. But Graham didn't add a single soothing sentence. He only said the one thing he could take responsibility for, that he wouldn't let them touch her. And he wasn't asking her to trust him right now. He was only asking her to survive this phase. Hannah turned away, moved closer to the glass, pressed her palm against the frigid, transparent barrier, and watched the cars below, tiny as toys, trying to find something to brace her crumbling pride, because she hated the feeling of needing a powerful man to be safe. She hated even more the memory of being dragged by Trent while no one saved her. She heard Graham's phone buzz. He answered, spoke a few short lines, then looked at Hannah as if weighing something. And at that moment, a woman stepped out of the elevator, crisp posture, sharp eyes, a thin folder in her hand, and Keating followed behind like habitual protection. The woman introduced herself as Sienna Hart, her voice quick but clear. No small talk because time wasn't on their side. She said she'd contacted a few people from the party. She'd already started gathering evidence for a protective order. But there was a bigger problem. The Calder Syndicate wouldn't accept money. They didn't want a simple payoff. They wanted proof the dispute was ended on their terms. They wanted an ending that let them keep their face and made everyone understand that no one walks away from the game without paying a price. Hannah felt the blood in her body go cold, because she understood immediately what lived behind those icy words. They wanted another public humiliation, a confirmation that she'd once been something that could be placed on a table. And now, for the first time since she'd stepped into this vault of a penthouse, Hannah realized this wasn't only about Trent anymore. This was a real game, wider, deeper, and far more dangerous than she'd imagined. Sienna's words made the air in the penthouse thicken, as if someone had just drawn a curtain across the sun, and Hannah stood still in the middle of the living room. A numbing tremor traced her spine when she heard the phrase "proof that the dispute ends on their terms," because she understood their terms were never a signed piece of paper and everyone going home. Their terms were a performance, a stamp pressed into dignity, so people would remember that there were forces that didn't need to shout to make a whole city bow its head. Hannah thought Graham would answer with anger, with a cold threat, or at least a firm statement like "I'll handle it," but he only turned the ring on his finger, listening like a man hearing a financial report, and then ask Sienna only one question. What do they want on paper, and what do they want off paper? Sienna said that on paper they'd talk about commitments, about ending the dispute, about Trent being given a chance. But off paper, they wanted Hannah to appear in a place they chose, in a way that let them keep their face, and that made anyone watching understand she'd once been in their hands. Hannah let out a short, joyless sound, more like breath being squeezed than laughter, because she'd lived her whole life trying not to be looked down on. Graham stayed calm. He said he wouldn't hand her over as proof for anyone, but he also didn't promise like a hero that he'd crush them overnight. He pivoted, practical, saying he'd deal with it through business and legal strategy, cutting off money paths, raising the risk of investigation, forcing Calder to see that clinging to Hannah wasn't worth the cost. Hannah watched him, and a strange resistance rose in her chest, because she was used to powerful men proving power with violence, and Graham's method was as clinical as a ledger. It was power as a game. It scared her because it showed he'd lived in this world so long he didn't need to throw a single punch to make someone bleed in a way the law could still call legal. Sienna nodded and said she would file immediately for an emergency temporary protective order, gather statements, recover party camera data, and build a record so that if Calder crossed the line, there would be enough cause to drag federal attention into it. Hannah heard the word federal and felt her breath falter, because she'd always believed the law was something men like Trent lived beyond, and now it was becoming the only shield. Thin, but real. The conversation ended in short sentences. Graham told Keating to recheck every layer of security. Sienna left to make calls, and for the first time since walking into the penthouse, Hannah found a moment quiet enough to sit down, lean back into a chair, close her eyes, and try to breathe the way she'd learned during sleepless nights. Slow inhale, hold, exhale, telling herself last night was over, telling herself she was alive, telling herself that here, at least, no hands reaching to claim her. She opened her eyes and went into the kitchen to find a glass of water, clinging to small actions as a way to keep her body from tipping into panic. And just as she was pouring, a small sound snapped from the ceiling, not loud, just a dry beep, like a machine reminding everyone it was still alive. Keating appeared almost immediately, his eyes skimming the wall panel, his fingers moving fast, his expression still controlled but his shoulders tightening slightly. Hannah asked what was wrong, her voice trying to stay normal while her hands had already gone cold. Keating didn't answer at once. He stared at the screen, then said the system had just registered a brief interference. The hallway camera on this floor had been shut off for a few minutes and then turned itself back on. A few minutes. Hannah heard those words and her whole body went numb, because in her life, a few minutes was enough for a door to open, a photo to be taken, a message to be sent, enough for fear to become fact. She looked at Keating, waiting for reassurance that everything was still fine. But Keating only told the truth, not in a panicked voice, but in the voice of someone who never lies, because lies get people killed. They couldn't get into the apartment, but they wanted us to know they can touch the system. Hannah's throat burned dry. Heat rushed into her face and then turned to ice. She set the glass down with hands shaking so hard the water trembled and spilled over the rim. She could hear blood roaring in her ears, and in her mind there was only one hollow thought. If they can shut off the hallway camera in Graham Sloane's building, then what am I to them? A prey animal hiding under the roof of a larger beast, and still someone is confident enough to tap the cage. Graham stepped into the kitchen, saw the wet streak on the stone counter, and Hannah's pale face, and he didn't ask much. He only glanced at the panel and told Keating to raise the protection immediately. Change codes, sweep devices, call the technical team. Every word was sharp and clean, no panic. But Hannah felt something else in him, a quiet anger, not because he'd been challenged, but because someone had pushed fear one step closer to her. Hannah looked at him, her voice breaking. They got in, didn't they? Graham said they reached the edge, enough to say hello, and that hello was the frightening part, because it didn't need to touch her. It only needed to make her believe no place was truly safe. While Hannah was still trying to breathe, a small door chime sounded, not the main bell, an internal signal that a delivery had arrived at the private lobby. Keating went to check, then returned, holding a cream-colored envelope like he was carrying evidence. He set it on the kitchen counter beneath the white light, and Hannah saw its unsettling cleanliness. No fingerprints, no creases, as if no human hand had ever touched it. Only a single line printed sharply on the front. No signature, no explanation. He can't keep you safe. Hannah went rigid, eyes locked on the words like they were a new sentence. And in that moment she understood something small and cruel. Calder didn't need to resort to physical intimidation. They only needed to prove that even Graham Sloane couldn't protect her completely. Because once trust is snapped, she'll walk away from safety on her own. And that will be the cleanest way for them to take her. That night, Hannah barely slept. Not the kind of sleeplessness caused by coffee or by the city's noise, but the kind where the body lies still, while the mind runs like a door that refuses to close. Every time she shut her eyes, she saw the words on the envelope under the kitchen light. "He can't keep you safe," like a whisper pressed close to her ear, like a needle finding the one place where trust had only just begun to grow before it was snapped clean off. She heard the security system cycling through new codes. She heard Keating's footsteps in the hallway like a living clock. She even heard the distant elevator, as if someone were coming up. And by the time dawn was close, she realized she'd been curled into the armchair, her coat still on her shoulders, her eyes burning dry, her hand clenched around her phone as if it were a life ring. When Graham appeared in the living room that morning, he saw her right away. He didn't ask why she hadn't slept. He didn't tell her to calm down. He simply set a cup of hot tea on the table and said in a low voice that the system had been swept. There was no sign of physical entry, only an electronic interference long enough to send a message. Hannah gave a thin, bitter smile, because for her, that message had done what a punch might not have managed to do. It made her doubt everything. The glass wall in front of her, the locks, the steady presence of the man who claimed to be her shield. She began to look at Graham through a different lens, not only as the man who'd pulled her out from under Trent, but as the man who now held the power to decide where she slept, where she went, who was allowed to see her. And in Hannah's world, that power had once belonged to Trent. She hated how old memories automatically layered themselves over the present. She hated how her body reacted before her mind could separate one danger from another, but she couldn't stop the questions from rising. If Calder could shut off a hallway camera for a few minutes, what else could they do? And did Graham truly control everything? Or did he only want her to believe he did? Keating clearly increased the protection. An extra man at the private lobby, another in the hall, everything so smooth that if you weren't paying attention, you might mistake it for luxury building service. But Hannah could see the tension in the way they stood, in the way their eyes swept, in the way they never turned their backs on a door. Graham tightened the routine in a firmer voice. Entry and exit times, elevator routes, a list of approved numbers, but he didn't lock Hannah's door. He didn't keep her key. And when she stood and moved toward the exit as if testing the line, he only said one thing. "You have the right to leave any time, Hannah. It's just not safe." It wasn't a threat. It sounded like a warning at the edge of a cliff, and that calmness only confused her more, because Trent used prohibition to keep her, while Graham used truth to make her choose to stay. Around midday, Sienna returned with a stack of documents, her expression focused. No time for small talk. She said she'd filed for an emergency temporary protective order, contacted a few people from the party, submitted requests to pull internal building camera data and personal device footage if they consented, and most important, she'd found someone willing to testify that Trent had dragged Hannah to the balcony and assaulted her in front of the crowd. Hannah heard the word testify and felt her heart tighten in a different way. Not fear, but a tiny thread of hope, as if finally someone might speak the truth instead of turning away. Sienna said it was a bartender who'd worked the party. He'd seen it. He'd wanted to step in. He'd been signaled into silence by a manager, and that night he'd even given Hannah a glass of water when she passed him in a panic. Hannah dimly remembered a stranger's eyes on her, full of apology, and she suddenly wanted to believe there were still good people in this world. Sienna scheduled a confirmation call for the afternoon, saying that if the statement was signed, they'd have a stronger foundation for a no-contact order and a harassment file. Hannah waited for that call the way you wait for a rope being thrown down. And for the first time in months, she felt she could hold on to something that wasn't fear. But when the time came, Sienna's phone only rang into silence and then rolled to voicemail. She tried again. And again. Her face cooled, and finally she looked at Hannah and said he wasn't answering anymore. An hour later, a short message arrived from a number that wasn't saved under a name on Sienna's screen. "I'm sorry. I can't. If I talk, I'll lose my job, and my family won't have rent money." There was no direct threat. There was no name, but Hannah understood the shadow behind it at once. Power didn't need to show its face. It only needed to touch someone's livelihood with one finger, and they'd go quiet. Her throat closed. not from disappointment alone, but from a cruel familiarity. The truth is always more expensive than ordinary people can afford. Last night in the penthouse, 50 people had watched and looked away because they had something to lose, and today one person had promised to speak, and then disappeared, because he also had something to lose. Hannah laughed, but the sound broke into a trembling breath, her eyes stinging, and in that moment she realized the most terrifying power wasn't the crude violence of a man like Trent. It was the force that could buy the silence of a whole room, by the retreat of a witness, by the victim's isolation. She looked at Graham and wanted to ask whether he could buy a statement back the way he'd bought a contract. Wanted to ask if everything in this world was a transaction. But she didn't ask, because she was afraid of the answer. Graham only said Sienna would find another way. They'd use data, records, things that didn't require human courage. But Hannah heard another truth inside that promise. In this world, courage is the thing most easily crushed. By evening, when the penthouse settled into soft light and the city outside began to glow, Hannah stood before the towering floor-to-ceiling pane and watched the streams of traffic like the bloodstream of a massive beast. She understood that if she stayed here like an object being protected, she'd die in a different way. Die by forgetting who she was beyond a target. She needed to know who this man really was, what rules his world ran on, what game Calder was playing, and most of all, where the line was between protection and control. When Keating stepped out to change shifts, Hannah quietly took her coat, slipped a backup phone into her pocket, and waited for the exact moment the private elevator opened and Graham stepped out with a folder in his hand. She lowered her head as if she was exhausted, and when he turned his back to go to his office, she moved quickly into the hallway, hid in a blind corner near the service elevator area, her heart slamming like it wanted out of her chest, and in the silence stretched tight as wire, Hannah made a decision that terrified her and made her feel alive at the same time. She would follow Graham, watch his world with her own eyes, because only by knowing where she was standing could she decide which side she would stand on. Hannah had thought she'd turn back the second she stepped into the service elevator, that fear would win, and she'd hate herself for being stupid. But her body moved as if something were pulling her forward. Not Graham, not Keating, but the question that refused to die in her head. Whose house am I living in? And who am I hiding from? She followed Graham down to the private lobby, keeping far enough back not to be seen, slipping behind a stone column whenever he paused, pretending to be a resident out for a walk, her heart hammering so hard she was afraid the sound of it would leak into the air. Graham went straight to his car. No loud entourage, only a driver and a man in the front seat, built like security but not showy about it. Hannah waited until they pulled away, then called another car, gave an address nearby but not the same, and told the driver to follow the black car ahead. Keep distance, don't let them notice. Her voice was hoarse and shaking, but the driver only nodded, as if in New York he'd heard every strange request there was, and nothing surprised him anymore. The car moved through neighborhoods that changed color fast. The luxury glow thinned out. Wide streets turned into darker stretches. Warehouses and parking lots replaced storefronts. Hannah looked out and saw the city wearing a different face, less decoration, more concrete. And she understood why Graham talked about safety like a conditional thing, because there were places where one wrong turn was enough to make you stop being treated like a normal person. Graham's car turned into a sealed garage, a steel door opening, and then closing like it swallowed all sound. Hannah paid her driver, got out across the street, and crouched behind a parked truck, her heart pounding, her breathing so shallow her chest hurt. She edged closer in small steps, clinging to shadows and blind corners, and through a cracked opening, she saw cold white light poured onto concrete. No chaos, no shouting, only a few men spaced out like pillars, so silent even their shoes seemed swallowed. Graham stood in the center, not leaning, not folding his arms, simply standing straight, as if that uprightness itself was power. Across from him was an older man, dressed plainly, but wearing an expensive watch, his face blank, his eyes measuring. Hannah guessed he was Calder's man. No one called names loudly. No one performed. They spoke in short sentences, enough to be heard in the closed space, but not enough for an outsider to understand the full meaning. And that was what made Hannah's skin go cold, because the pressure here wasn't in action. It was in the silence between words. Calder's man spoke first, his voice low, as if stating something obvious. He said the contract had changed hands, the money had moved, but their honor still hadn't been paid. Graham answered with one short line, "What do you want?" The man gave a small, joyless smile and said they didn't want more money. They wanted an ending that made people understand Calder hadn't been forced, that they had chosen to pull back as a favor. And to do that, they needed a public statement, a public appearance by the girl, not to hurt her, but so others could see they'd once had the right to touch her and had voluntarily let go. Hearing that, Hannah's hands went numb with cold. She gripped the metal edge of the door like it was a rope, because public statement sounded clean, but what lived underneath it was a slap to dignity, a reminder that she had once been placed on a table like an object. Graham didn't raise his voice. He only tipped his head slightly, his gaze darkening, and said, "She won't appear to serve your pride." Calder's man shrugged and said, if they didn't get pride, they had other ways to take it back. Ways that didn't require touching her and still made her step out, like what they'd just done with his hallway camera. Hannah's stomach tightened, because she understood. He was talking about the envelope on the kitchen counter, the message that even safety could be pierced. Graham stayed where he was, not backing up, not stepping forward, and said one sentence like a stamp. "You're playing a game that makes an innocent person panic, so you can feed your ego." The older man replied that in their world there was no such thing as innocent, only people who were in and people who were out, and that girl had been dragged in already. Hannah's throat constricted, tears threatening from anger and humiliation. She wanted to run out, wanted to scream that she hadn't chosen to enter their world, wanted to ask what gave them the right to call it law, but she couldn't, because one sound would be enough to turn every face toward her, and just as she started to step back, her heel caught a small stone. A dry click snapped across the concrete like a drop of water hitting a still pond. Everything froze. Heads turned in the same beat. Hannah felt blood rush to her face and then drain away. She stood rigid, her hand slipping off the door, and in a moment that stretched forever, she knew she'd made the stupidest mistake of her life. Graham didn't turn immediately, but Hannah saw his shoulders tighten, and then he pivoted slowly, his eyes finding her in the dark corner as if he'd known she was there all along and had only been waiting for her to reveal herself. He walked toward her, not running, not rushing, just moving with a certainty that made people step back without thinking, and his hand closed around her elbow and drew her out of the shadows. Hannah flinched, tried to pull away, but Graham's grip wasn't brutal. It was a clamp, holding her in place so she wouldn't fling herself into danger. He pulled her straight to the car, opened the door, guided her into the back seat, shut it, then walked around and got in beside her, and the space inside the car felt like all the oxygen had been drained out. Hannah turned her face away, shame flaring hot in her skin. She'd broken the rules. She'd done something insane, and if anything happened, she would be the one paying for it. Graham didn't shout. He didn't slam his fist, but when he spoke, his voice was more frightening than yelling, because it was held so tightly it trembled. "What do you think you're doing, Hannah?" She cried immediately. Not from weakness, but because the pressure had been packed down too long. Tears spilled hot. She turned toward him, her voice breaking apart. "I'm not a thing to be negotiated. I'm not something you can place on a table. I'm not a name in a contract. I'm not the price they demand to keep their pride. And I'm not a doll you can lock in a penthouse and call it rescue." Graham looked at her, the anger in his eyes, not anger at her defiance, but anger that she'd put herself at the mouth of a pit. He inhaled as if swallowing something heavy, then said quietly, "I didn't want you to see that world like this, because once you see it, you won't trust anyone again." Hannah gave a bitter laugh and said, "I don't trust anyone anymore." Graham went silent for a few seconds, the silence heavy as stone, and then he let one sentence slip, like it slid out from under his own control. "I've known your name longer than you think," and the instant the words landed, Hannah stopped crying, her heart clamping tight, because that sentence opened a new door more terrifying than all the rest. That the night at the penthouse wasn't the first time they'd touched her life. It was only the first time she'd realized. On the way back to the penthouse, Hannah sat in silence, wiping tears with the back of her hand. But the more she wiped, the dirtier she felt inside, like ash had settled over her skin. Graham's words kept looping in her head like a tape stuck on repeat. He'd known her name longer than she thought, and that single line made every memory surge forward like floodwater, not to explain anything to him, but to explain to herself why one sentence could make her shake that hard. The day Hannah's mother died, there was nothing cinematic about it. Just an ordinary afternoon in the suburbs of New Jersey. Gray skies, the sharp smell of disinfectant, the steady pulse of machines, and a little girl standing beside a hospital bed, biting her lip so she wouldn't cry, afraid it would hurt her mother more. After the funeral, the small house became strangely wide and cold, as if the walls themselves didn't know where warmth was supposed to stay. Her father tried at first, tried to carry 2 roles at once, and then he began to slide, in a way Hannah was too young to name, small loans turning into larger ones, late nights turning into nights that never came home, promises that it would be okay turning into muttered complaints that life was unfair. Hannah grew up with the feeling that she had to carry herself, teach herself how to take part-time jobs, pay for her own books, choose her own schools, smile at outsiders so no one would know her home was cracking, and most of all, convince herself that if she was good enough, obedient enough, quiet enough, nothing would collapse. But life doesn't spare the good children. It just waits until you're tired, and then pushes again. When Hannah met Trent, she was already a young woman newly arrived in New York, working and studying at the same time, always walking fast because she feared missing a train, always checking her balance because she feared a card being declined. Trent appeared like the kind of miracle she'd once believed in. Handsome, confident, saying the right thing at the right time, ready to pick her up in the rain, ready to place a hand on her back as she walked into a crowded room, making her feel, for the first time, like she didn't have to hold everything up alone. He called her special, someone who deserved protection, and Hannah swallowed those words the way you swallow water after years of thirst. She just didn't realize those words were the first rope. At first it was sweet suggestions that her friends didn't understand her, that her co-workers took advantage of her, that the world outside was full of bad people and only he was sincere. Then it was the way Trent wanted to know where she was going, who she was seeing, when she'd be home, saying he worried, saying he only wanted to be sure she was safe. Hannah had felt warm, because she was used to no one worrying about her at all, until one day she realized the questions had become rules, the worry had become surveillance, the hugs had become grips, and her objections had become punishments, stretches of silence that made her feel guilty, even when she'd done nothing wrong. Trent trimmed away the relationships around her the way you prune a tree, until only he and silence were left. And Hannah, afraid of loneliness, afraid of being wrong, afraid of being a burden, stayed longer than she should have. The night at the Tribeca penthouse was only the first time the outside world saw what Hannah had been enduring in the dark. And the truth that scared her most wasn't what Trent could do to her. It was the feeling that the world would look and then decide she deserved it, that she chose it, that she was stupid, that if she were better she wouldn't have ended up there. She'd heard those lines aimed at other women online, and deep down she was terrified that one day they'd be said about her. When the car stopped at the penthouse, Graham didn't lead her in like a prisoner being returned to a cell. He opened the door and stepped aside, letting her walk in on her own, a small but unmistakable gesture that the choice was still hers, even if the risk wasn't. In the living room, he handed her a sheet of paper with a few phone numbers. Sienna's number, the number for a trauma therapy center, and the number for a victim support hotline. No poetry, just tools. He said she didn't have to tell him everything, if she didn't want to. But she needed a professional so her brain would stop scaring her with its loops, and she needed a legal plan so Trent couldn't reach into her life through dirty tricks. Hannah stared at those numbers like a rescue kit. Something no one had ever placed in her hands before. And something in her softened even as anger burned, because why did these things only appear after she'd already been dragged to the edge? She lifted her head and looked at Graham, her voice rough but clear. From now on, no decisions get made over my head anymore. My agency is no longer up for negotiation. Graham didn't react like a man offended. He nodded like someone who'd been waiting for her to say it, and answered simply, "Okay, you'll know every step, and every final choice will be yours." Just as Hannah was fighting not to cry again at the strange feeling of being respected without having to beg for it, Graham's phone buzzed. He checked the screen, then showed it to Hannah, Sienna's name glowing there, and her voice came through the speaker fast and sharp as a blade. "I've got bad news. Trent just filed a countersuit against Hannah, accusing her of misuse and damages. The goal isn't money. The goal is to drag her into the light, force her to appear, and smear her name before the protective order can take effect." And Hannah felt the floor tilt under her, because she understood Trent was doing what he did best, turning the victim into the guilty one. And this time he didn't only want to pull her hair, he wanted to drag her whole life into the mud. The news that Trent had countersued made Hannah feel like she'd been shoved back into the Tribeca party. not by a hand in her hair, but by something colder and cleaner. Paperwork, signatures, lines of text that could turn a woman trying to survive into someone dissected in front of strangers. She listened to Sienna talk about the filing, and in her head only one thought kept ringing: going to court is suicide, because a courtroom isn't a chandelier-lit room where people can look away. A courtroom is where her story will be told by people who don't understand her at all, where Trent will stand straight and look at her like she's the one who ruined his life. Hannah wanted to say no. She wanted to disappear. She wanted to go back to the version of herself from 3 months ago, the one who thought changing her number and changing her route home meant she'd escaped. But Graham didn't force her to calm down. He only said this was exactly why they had to move one step ahead, because Trent was trying to drag her into the light when she had nothing in her hands except fear. Sienna came to the penthouse the next morning with a thicker file, her hair neat, her eyes sharp, her voice fast but not frantic, like someone used to walking hallways where other people's fates are decided by deadlines and stamps. She looked at Hannah and didn't promise it would be easy. She only told the truth, that if Hannah ran now, Trent would tell his story first, and that story would be a trap. Hannah asked in a shaking voice what they wanted her to do, how to appear, what to say, and Sienna shook her head and said they weren't going to put Hannah on the stage the way Trent wanted. They were going to turn his countersuit into a trap that snapped back on him. Hannah had thought this fight would be direct confrontations, Trent showing up out of nowhere, a hand on her arm in a crowd, but Sienna pulled it all into a different place, a place where violence doesn't work, where people win with filings, deadlines, and who gets paperwork in first. She explained that they would respond by seeking an emergency no-contact order based on the threats and assault at the party. And more than that, they would ask the court to consider that Trent was using litigation as harassment, not as a real effort to recover legitimate rights. Hannah listened and felt her breathing tighten, because she'd grown up believing the law was a luxury. But Sienna said the law is like a door that only opens for the person who knows exactly where to knock, and they were going to knock in the right place, at the right time, in the court's own language. Meanwhile, Graham sat at the kitchen table with his laptop open, not entering the room through emotion, only asking Sienna what she needed to move faster, what data she needed, who she needed to sign what, and Hannah could see the difference between him and Trent with painful clarity. Trent used emotion to push her into a corner. Graham used structure to build an exit, even if that exit still had high walls. Sienna began listing what they could gather immediately: call logs, messages, threats, and especially party camera footage, because if there was video of Trent dragging Hannah toward the balcony, his entire story would snap at the root. Hannah remembered the eyes that had turned away, and the shame rose again. She asked how they could get the footage when the host and the guests were all afraid of scandal. Sienna said they'd made formal requests, and while they waited, she was also approaching personal devices of people who'd been there, because someone had recorded something, or at the very least the building system had captured it. But by midday, Sienna received an update that changed her face completely. The hallway camera near the balcony and the main staircase camera had been wiped, the data deleted for the exact window when the incident happened. Hannah felt her heart drop straight through her, because it was like the universe repeating the same message. Her truth always disappears at the moment it's needed most. Sienna didn't speak like a defeated woman. She spoke like an analyst. This deletion didn't look like a technical glitch or an accidental click. It had the signature of a professional service, a clean cut at the right segment, at the right time, with no clumsy traces. Hannah blurted out, "Can Trent even do that? He isn't that good." And that was the moment Sienna looked at Graham, then at Hannah, her voice lower, because this was the real twist. The people who wiped the camera weren't Trent's. They traced the pathway of the request, and it led to a name Trent couldn't hire with cash and desperation. It led to Calder. Hannah went still, because that meant Trent was only a pawn, an abuser being used by someone else, and her humiliation at the party hadn't been only Trent's cruelty. It had been a performance with a real audience behind it. Graham didn't show much, but his jaw tightened, and he said one short sentence. They're using Trent to force Hannah to surface on their terms, and they're cutting off her legal path by breaking evidence at the source. Hannah felt cold sweep through her. She asked what was left now, and Sienna answered, "There's always something left, because when a piece of evidence vanishes, you go looking for the fingerprints of the person who made it vanish." She said they would use the deletion itself as an argument that there was interference, concealment, a force that wanted to stop the court from seeing the truth, and that could bring a judge's attention closer rather than farther. But Hannah heard the word judge and still felt her throat close, because she didn't want her life to become a case file. Late in the afternoon, while they were still talking through response deadlines, protective order timelines, the window to stop Trent from continuing his harassment, Keating stepped in and placed his phone on the table like setting down a foreign object. He said a message had come through from someone who left no name, through a channel only people in Graham's world used. Graham looked at the screen, read it, didn't speak right away, then passed it to Sienna. Sienna read, her eyes darkening, and then she turned to Hannah with a careful voice, like handing a knife to someone who wasn't used to holding one. Calder is offering a final negotiation. They say if Graham wants the dispute ended and everything to stop, Hannah has to appear publicly in the way they define, so they can declare the story concluded in their honor. Hannah felt the room spin, because it was exactly what they'd said in the garage. A public statement, a new stage, and now it wasn't a suggestion. It was a trap wrapped in the word final, as if she didn't step out, both the law and security would keep getting torn open piece by piece. After Calder's final invitation to negotiate, the penthouse stopped feeling like a shelter. It became a waiting room before a stage, and Hannah realized the most terrifying part of that invitation wasn't that they demanded she appear. It was the choice they set on her shoulders like a beautiful trap. Either she kept hiding while they shredded her life piece by piece with filings, rumors, leaks, and other people's silence, or she stepped out once, faced the world's stare, and took her name back before Trent and Calder could define her the way they wanted. Hannah stood at the glass, the city spread below, her palm pressed to the cold surface, and in her mind 2 images rose. One was the Hannah from 3 months ago, quietly changing numbers, changing train routes, telling herself that if she disappeared, everything would pass. The other was the Hannah from the Tribeca night, dragged like an object beneath chandeliers, watching elegant people look away as if it were instinct. She didn't want to go back to either image, but she understood this too. Hiding forever isn't living. It's only existing in the dark, letting fear become your breathing. Sienna laid out the plan with clarity. They weren't accepting the invitation as surrender. They were going to turn any public appearance into a statement backed by evidence, by witnesses, by cameras, by legal boundaries, so that if Trent or anyone else crossed that boundary, they'd turn themselves into lawbreakers in front of the public. Keating spoke about routes, entry points, timing, like he was describing a security movement, and Hannah listened and felt like she was about to step onto a suspension bridge. She looked at Graham, waiting for the final sentence, the one that would sound like an order, that he would decide for her the way men had decided for her before. But Graham stayed silent longer than usual, and then he said in a low, even voice, like a concession he wasn't used to making, "I won't speak for you." Hannah lifted her head, her heart tightening, because that wasn't romance. It was power being returned, something she'd lost a long time ago. Graham went on. If they stepped out in public, she would be the one to speak her line. No one else. Not him, not the lawyer, not security. Because Calder wanted face, Trent wanted control, and the only thing sharp enough to cut through both was a boundary spoken in Hannah's own voice, in front of people who couldn't pretend they hadn't heard. Hannah swallowed hard and asked what if she said it wrong? What if she shook? What if she cried? Graham didn't soothe her. He only said if she shakes, she shakes. If she cries, she cries. As long as she says the core truth and lets the cameras do the rest. Sienna set a sheet of paper on the table with a few short lines. Not a speech, not a long accusation, but a boundary statement. Clean, clear, and strong enough to stand in court. Hannah read, her eyes moving over each word as if crossing a narrow bridge, and then Sienna told her to practice saying it. The first time Hannah tried, her voice broke mid-sentence. Her hand shook so hard the paper rattled. Heat rushed into her face with shame, and the old reflex rose. Shaking means weak. Weak means you get crushed. But then she remembered the Tribeca night, remembered how she'd tried to stay calm and still got her hair yanked, and she understood. Shame isn't shaking. Shame is staying silent when you have the right to speak. She inhaled and tried again, this time not looking at the paper, looking straight into empty space as if a person stood there. The lines were short, clear, no need to spill her whole life story, no need to beg for pity, only to place a boundary nobody could deny. Don't touch me. I don't consent, and if she was approached or threatened, she would call the police and her lawyer, and everything would be recorded. Hannah got through the full statement, her voice still trembling. And the strange thing was that this time, she didn't feel ashamed of the trembling. She felt proud that even trembling, she had spoken. She practiced again and again, and each time her voice steadied a little, not because fear vanished, but because she began to believe fear no longer had the right to lock her mouth. Graham stood nearby, not adding words, only watching like a guard for her autonomy, and Keating nodded now and then, as if confirming that this boundary would be backed by action. When the practice ended, Hannah felt emptied out, but she also felt something inside her coming back to life, like she'd found a spine that had been bent for too long. She went into her room, washed her face, looked in the mirror, saw her eyes were red but no longer hollow, and just as she was about to set her phone down and breathe, the screen lit up with a message from an unknown number. She didn't need to look to know who it was, because the way Trent wrote was the way he touched other people, without permission, without hesitation, straight into the most painful place. The message was one sentence: "He didn't save you for free." And Hannah felt cold wash through her whole body, because it struck the oldest fear she'd carried since childhood, that nobody helps without demanding a price, that every hand offered comes with a hook, that even protection can be another form of ownership. She stood still in the room, with the phone in her hand like a cold stone. She wondered if she had simply traded one set of chains for another, more elegant pair. The day they chose to step out wasn't marked as anything special on the city's calendar. Manhattan was still loud the way it always is. People still rushed with coffee cups in their hands. Calls still buzzed in earbuds. But for Hannah, it was the day she had to decide whether she would live like a ghost or like a human being with a name. Sienna organized everything clean and tight, like a legal script. Not flashy, not a public provocation designed to inflame, only a plan that turned every shadow into light so Calder couldn't play in the gray. They chose a public space that was just upscale enough to matter to Calder's people, and open enough that everything could be recorded. A small gathering under Madeline's name, framed as a networking event, limited guests, a check-in list, venue security, plus outside security hired legally. Keating checked the route, the departure time from the penthouse, the arrival window, the private entrance, the backup exit, and most of all, the camera placement. Not one camera that could be shut off, but multiple angles, multiple sources, venue systems, Madeline's crew, and a protection team tasked with recording as part of the security report. Sienna also arranged for 2 off-duty police officers working legally. They didn't carry a threatening air. They simply stood like people who know the law and know how to write a report if anyone crosses a line. Hannah wore something simple, not to impress, but so no one could claim she was performing. She looked at herself in the mirror and saw her hands still trembling slightly, and this time she didn't try to hide it. She inhaled and remembered what Graham had said: "If you shake, as long as you speak." When the car pulled away, Hannah gripped her bag strap, Trent's text echoing like a hook, a poisonous reminder that every rescue in her world usually came with a hidden price tag, the rare good things in her life. But she also knew that if she let Trent control the story, she'd be controlled by fear forever. They arrived on time. The private entrance opened. Keating went first. A venue staffer checked the list. The lobby lighting was warm and softer than Tribeca. Not harsh, not stage-like. And that was the point. To make everything look normal, transparent, with no dark corners for a hunter to hide in. Madeline waited inside, her face pale, her eyes red as if she'd cried hard. But this time she stood straight, holding a microphone in both hands, like someone trying to repay a moment of silence from that night. She introduced the event briefly, spoke about safety, about respect, about everyone having the right to leave if they felt uncomfortable, and there was an apology in her voice that didn't use a name, but Hannah heard it anyway. When it was time for Hannah to enter the main space, everything seemed to get quieter. No one knew who she was, or some people knew and pretended they didn't, and that made Hannah feel safer, because she didn't want pity. She only wanted the right to exist. Graham came in right behind her, not beside her like he was claiming space, but one step back, like a quiet boundary, like the promise he'd made that he wouldn't speak for her. Hannah felt his presence like a rail, not to hold her in place, only to keep her from falling. She took a few more steps and saw the cameras in the corners, saw the red recording lights, saw Sienna nearby with a thin folder, saw the 2 off-duty officers at the edge of the room, and for the first time she understood what transparency really means. Not showing off, but turning every dirty trick into self-destruction. Then Trent arrived like a familiar shadow. Not loud, not rushing. He walked in as if the room belonged to him, his smile adjusted, hair neat, jacket fitted, looking like a man with a legitimate reason to be there. Hannah's insides clenched. Her body wanted to step back on instinct, but she forced her feet to stay planted. Trent tried to come closer, but Keating shifted a single step, not touching him, only placing his body where the path was blocked, without giving anyone a reason to start a shove. One off-duty officer looked straight at Trent and spoke in the normal tone of someone stating a building rule. "Keep your distance, sir." Trent smiled like he hadn't heard, but his eyes darkened, and Hannah saw the irritation of a man who relies on private violence when he's forced to be polite in public. He couldn't put his hands on her, so he changed tactics. He tilted his head and spoke low enough that only Hannah could hear, close enough that his breath pulled her back to the Tribeca night. "You think you got away?" Then he released a line like a needle, not mentioning Graham, not mentioning Calder, but reaching for something deeper. "Your father's old debt still isn't paid off, Hannah." Hannah went ice cold, not because she believed everything he said, but because he had found the one wound she kept buried, deepest. Her father, the bills, the nights she'd stayed up doing math until her head hurt, the feeling of carrying what adults should have carried. Her vision blurred. Facing Trent, the old tremors returned, but Hannah anchored herself to the lens of the recording camera. "Don't touch me," she said, her voice a newfound blade. The room seemed to freeze for a beat, because it wasn't a plea. It was a legal boundary, a declaration that couldn't be twisted into something else. Trent blinked. His smile cracked. He started to say something, but his words hit a different kind of silence this time. Not the silence of people looking away, but the silence of people listening. Hannah didn't speak long. She repeated the boundary and said any unwanted approach or threat would be recorded and sent to her lawyer, and she didn't belong to anyone. Trent lost control for a small, sharp moment. He stepped forward despite the warning, his voice rising, his eyes flashing with the violent impatience he always kept under the polished surface. "Are you done acting? Hannah, you think they'll believe you." And that line, that slip of the mask, finally made the people around him see him the way they see a man revealing what he really is. The off-duty officer moved in and ordered him to step back. Sienna signaled the cameras to capture it clearly. Keating held position, and Hannah stayed still, tears rolling down her face, but she didn't turn away, because she knew that this time, the stage was hers, and the rules had changed. The moment Trent slipped out of his polite mask and let the outburst show in front of everyone, the space around Hannah seemed to change color, like a film flipping to its other side, because this time no one could say they hadn't seen it. No one could pretend it was only a misunderstanding or a rich people's joke. The off-duty officers moved in exactly by procedure. No tackling, no chaos, only positioning themselves where Trent had to stop, their voices clear, ordering him to keep his distance, to leave the area, reminding him that any unwanted approach could be documented on the spot. Keating stayed a wall between Hannah and Trent, not touching Trent so he couldn't claim a pretext, but close enough that every step Trent tried was blocked. Sienna didn't argue with Trent. She didn't lecture him. She only signaled the recording crew to hold the angle. Capture the face, capture the words, capture the time. Because she understood that in this war, emotion doesn't beat evidence. Hannah stood there, tears still on her cheeks, but her back was straight, and that made Trent even more irritated, because he was used to watching her shake and retreat, used to watching her apologize, used to watching her doubt herself, and now she stood like a line he couldn't bend in public. Trent was ordered to leave. He turned his head to look at Hannah one last time, his eyes promising a slow revenge. Then he walked out with his rage leashed, leaving behind a room that could finally breathe again. Madeline set the microphone down with trembling hands, her gaze clinging to Hannah as if she wanted to apologize one more time. But Hannah didn't need an apology right now. She needed to leave before her body collapsed. Graham didn't hug her. He didn't pull her into his arms like a scene from a movie. He only placed a very light hand against her back, a signal that the exit was open. And Hannah followed, each step heavy as stone, but each step still hers. In the car, when the door shut and the noise of the event was cut off outside, Hannah realized her legs were shaking so hard she couldn't feel her knees. She breathed fast like she'd been running, her hand clenched into the leather seat, and in that private moment the tears came harder, not because of Trent, but because of the strange relief of finally being seen, cameras seeing, law acknowledging, witnesses existing without disappearing within the same night. Sienna called almost immediately, her voice quick, saying they already had enough to seek an emergency protective order. Trent's behavior was clearly recorded. His unwanted approach and the threatening tone would become the foundation for a harassment file, and she would file before Trent's lawyer could pivot. Hearing that, Hannah felt a flicker of relief, the rare sensation of not being completely passive. But then Sienna added one sentence that shook that small footing. Trent has a good lawyer, and he'll drag procedure out. He'll ask for continuances. He'll argue about the right to be in public spaces. He'll play the victim of a setup, and because the legal system has its own rhythm, he won't vanish overnight the way Hannah wants. It was a bittersweet realization. Hannah had stepped out and spoken her boundary. Officers had intervened. Evidence existed. And part of her had thought everything would end like pushing a button. But life doesn't close as fast as a car door. It drags on with filings and deadlines. And in that stretch of time, the hunter is still out there. Graham listened to Sienna, gave a small nod, said he'd make sure the file was pushed for priority. But he also said the truth. They couldn't rely only on the court's speed while Calder was still watching. Hannah heard Calder's name and her throat went dry. Because tonight, even with Trent exposed, she still felt as if another set of eyes was watching over her shoulder, eyes that didn't need to explode to be terrifying. They returned to the penthouse by a quiet protocol. Keating checked doors, checked systems, changed elevator routes, everything like a security ritual, and Hannah clung to the smallest thing to keep herself from tipping into panic again. She had spoken. She had stood. She had not been dragged away. But just as she set her bag down, Keating's phone buzzed. He looked at the screen, and his expression shifted instantly, the way it does when someone sees a threat they can't dismiss. He handed the phone to Sienna, then to Graham, and Hannah saw a link to an anonymous rumor channel, a place that lived on whispered addresses, photos, schedules of celebrities and hunted people. On the screen was a fresh post, not using Hannah's full name, only writing it in a way that anyone looking would understand. The girl from the Tribeca incident is hiding at a temporary address, followed by details so specific, Hannah felt her blood turn to ice. A building, a floor range, a side entrance, and the time she'd been seen stepping out of a car. It wasn't Graham's penthouse address. It was the temporary hotel and a backup apartment Sienna had mentioned as an option if they ever needed to separate Hannah from the center, information that should never have left a tight inner circle. Hannah stared at the lines and felt cold flood her, because this was no longer a feeling of being watched. This was the outside world being handed breadcrumbs straight to her door, and someone had done it on purpose, to remind her that they could still reach her life even after she'd stood in front of cameras. Sienna said she'd report the post for removal, open another file for information leakage, audit who had access to that address. But Hannah didn't feel calm, because she understood the most dangerous thing about rumor isn't whether it's true or false. It's that if enough people believe it, the danger becomes real. She looked at Graham and saw his eyes darken like stone underwater, and in that moment, Hannah felt a truth clamp tight around her chest. Trent had exposed himself. But Trent wasn't the only player. Calder hadn't lost. They'd only changed the game, and their new game was turning her safety into something anyone could buy with an anonymous post. After the address leak, Graham didn't raise his voice. He didn't smash anything. He only grew quieter in a way that made the penthouse feel a few degrees colder. Because for men like him, anger isn't something you spill. Anger is something you turn into leverage. Keating was ordered to change every shelter plan. Sienna filed takedown requests and opened a leak file. And Graham sat at his desk like he was preparing for a shareholder meeting, his laptop screen packed with data, numbers, and charts Hannah didn't understand, but could still feel the weight of. She hovered in the doorway, arms wrapped tight around herself, her mind still spinning on the thought that someone knew where she could hide and anyone could find her. But what chilled her more was the fact that Graham didn't say what he'd do to the person who posted it. He only said he was going to cut off Trent's oxygen. The next morning, Hannah watched the war begin without a single gunshot, without a punch, only phones ringing non-stop in Graham's office, and clipped sentences that landed like signatures. Review the books, audit every satellite company, freeze cash flow through intermediary accounts, terminate contracts with partners who'd done business with Trent, send compliance and legal risk notices to people who'd been willing to look away. Hannah didn't grasp every meaning, but she saw the impact through the updates Sienna fed them. A few of Trent's accounts flagged for review by a bank, a real estate deal put on hold over suspicious funding, a longtime partner suddenly backing out, and the social ladders Trent used to climb quietly closing like rungs being pulled from a wall. Trent had been powerful because he had a foothold. He had people covering for him. He had money to buy silence. And now those layers were being stripped away by paperwork, and the right calls placed in the right places at the right times, leaving him nowhere to hide inside the clean world he still wanted to wear like a suit. At the same time, Graham wasn't only hitting Trent. He was sending a signal to Calder in Calder's own language. Not crude threats, but federal and media risk. He positioned files that could attract attention, markers that could be examined, money paths that could be traced, right where men like Calder would notice. Hannah heard Sienna talk about pressure without naming it, and she understood. This was a Cold War, where the winner doesn't have to swing a fist, only has to make the other side see that continuing will cost so much it won't be worth it. But that coldness also frightened Hannah, because it reminded her that Graham belonged to a world where people are measured in risk and profit, and she didn't want to become a number in anyone's spreadsheet, even if that spreadsheet was saving her. Late afternoon, with sunlight slanting across the glass, Graham's phone rang with a call that made Keating's posture change instantly. He didn't speak much. He only handed the phone to Graham and stepped back, as if making room for a different kind of weight. Graham answered, his voice still low, and Hannah stood in the hallway where she could catch fragments, the long silence on the other end not from bad service, but from someone making the other person wait. Then a man's voice came through, not loud, not twisted, cold as stone under water. "This is Wesley Calder." Hannah stopped breathing. The name moved through the living room like a gust that raised gooseflesh on her skin. This wasn't the representative from the garage. This wasn't the shadow behind Trent. This was the real name of the force that had erased footage and leaked an address. Wesley didn't curse. He didn't threaten directly. He only asked a question like placing a needle on a table. "You're willing to make me lose face over a girl?" It wasn't curiosity. It was a reminder of the rules, that face is currency, that a public concession can weaken an entire system of power. Graham answered evenly, "I'm not making you lose face. I'm just not letting you use an innocent person to pay for your honor." Wesley gave a thin, joyless laugh, then said he didn't care whether the girl was innocent. He cared what people would say when Calder backed down, and if Graham wanted peace, Graham needed to give him an ending that fit. Graham didn't promise. He didn't beg. He only said Wesley was turning a small matter into a large risk, and that risk would pull in people even Calder didn't want seen, hinting at federal and media attention without naming names, only using phrases sharp enough to make anyone who understood the rules go cold. The other end went quiet for a few seconds. Then Wesley said one last line like closing a box. "I'll wait to see what you choose," and he hung up. When the call ended, Hannah stepped into the office, her heart pounding, not from fear of Wesley, but from the question lodged in her throat since Trent had whispered about her father's debt. She looked at Graham and asked what he knew about her father's debt, why Trent dared to say it, and why Graham went quiet every time her father's name surfaced. In that moment, Hannah wasn't a woman being protected. She was a woman being kept from the truth about her own life. Graham didn't speak right away. He looked at her for a long beat, as if weighing the cost of telling against the cost of not telling. Then he exhaled and said he knew there was an old connection, but he wasn't sure he had enough to explain it yet, and he'd chosen to hold it back because he feared it would push her deeper into panic. Hannah snapped, her voice shaking more from anger than fear. "You don't have the right to choose for me. I just stood in front of cameras to take my name back, and you're still hiding the thing that could decide my entire future." Graham didn't argue. He opened a drawer, took out a sleek digital keycard, set it on the desk, then slid it toward Hannah like sliding a door open. He said she could leave right now. Keating would take her somewhere else that was safe. She didn't owe him trust, and he wouldn't keep her with a locked door. Hannah stared at the key, at Graham's hand resting still on the desk, and her chest ached because she realized this wasn't Trent. Trent would have yanked the key away. Graham was handing it to her. For a few seconds, Hannah wanted to run, to escape all of it. Calder, Trent, the world she didn't understand. But then she remembered the party, the boundary line she'd spoken, the envelope on the kitchen counter, and she understood that if she ran now, she'd keep running forever. Hannah picked up the key, gripped it until her fingertips went white, then set it back down in the exact same place. She looked Graham straight in the eye, and spoke the second condition of her life in a voice that no longer asked permission. "Tell me everything. I choose with the truth." Hannah's words hung in the air like a taut wire. "Tell me everything." And Graham looked at her for a long time. Not the way a man looks at a woman who makes him soft, but the way a man looks at someone who has just taken back the right to know, the right to choose, and he understood that if he kept hiding things, everything he was doing to protect her would become another kind of control, no matter how good his intentions were. He sat down in the chair across from her, not trying to make his voice gentle, not using vague language to duck the truth. He only said he would tell it in the order she needed to hear it, and she had the right to stop him at any time. Hannah didn't sit. She leaned against the edge of the desk, both hands braced on it as if to keep herself from falling, her eyes never leaving Graham, because she was too used to truth being bent, and this time she wanted to watch it go straight. Graham started years earlier, when he hadn't met Hannah, didn't even know what she looked like. He only knew a debt file that passed through Calder's system, a debt packaged, transferred, owned the way people trade stock, and inside that file was a name that would later cling to him like a scrap of paper that refused to fall. Hannah's father's name. Hearing her father's name made Hannah feel like someone had yanked a thread inside her chest, because she'd tried to live as if her father's life no longer had anything to do with hers, as if those debts were a wave that had receded. But Graham saying it had crossed Calder meant the wave had never truly gone. Graham said that at the time, a quiet collection push had been planned. Not men knocking on a door and shouting threats, but the kind that makes a debtor lose a job, lose credit, lose every way to breathe, until they collapse and surrender on their own. Graham had intervened then, not out of tenderness in the soft sense, but out of principle and interest. He didn't want Calder expanding that method into certain money routes Graham already controlled, and he didn't want that kind of collection pulling attention from agencies all of them wanted to avoid. He said plainly that he blocked that push, stalled the file, shoved it into a different drawer, and eventually it was forgotten the way things get forgotten when they stop producing quick profit. Hannah opened her mouth to ask if that meant her father had been saved, but Graham shook his head. In that world, nobody is ever fully saved, only delayed, and the price of delay is that the file still exists like a hook hanging somewhere. Hearing that hurt Hannah like being scraped raw, because she understood that the work she'd done to stand on her own, to build her life, wasn't as separated from her father's shadow as she'd believed. Graham said more years passed, and he'd forgotten that file until a new pattern started to surface around Trent Halford. Loans, abnormal cash movement, gambling debts, sketchy brokers, all of it pointing to the same thing. Trent was being pushed into debt on purpose, and when a man like Trent is cornered, he looks for something to put on the table. Graham said he didn't watch Hannah out of obsession. He didn't even know who she was, until his system flagged a familiar name connected to a young woman living in New York, and that familiar name was her father's. Hannah felt her stomach twist, because it meant Trent finding her wasn't only the random cruelty of an abuser choosing prey. It was one link in a longer chain, where she'd been chosen because she was the easiest weakness to exploit in an old debt. Graham said he started tracking from a distance in the most legal way his world allowed, not spying on her private life day by day, but having people check risk points, following Trent's movements, and when he saw Trent tightening control and threats around her, he knew the day Trent tried to use her as collateral was only a matter of time. Hearing that, Hannah felt anger and humiliation flare together, because she'd thought Trent chose her because she was weak, because she was alone, because she was easy to manipulate, and now there was another reason colder than all of that, because she could become the key to a debt. She asked Graham if he saved her out of responsibility or calculation, and the question cut like a blade, but Graham didn't dodge. He said that at first it was principle and responsibility. He would not allow Calder to use an uninvolved person to pay for honor, and he would not let an old debt become a trap that dragged a woman down. He said the fact that he'd intervened in that file years ago was what made him recognize Hannah as a vulnerable link, and he couldn't pretend he hadn't seen it when the signs returned. Then he paused, his voice lower, and said after that, it changed. When he saw her at the Tribeca party being dragged like an object while the whole room looked away, he realized this was no longer an abstract principle. This was a human being getting crushed in front of him, and he couldn't stand still. That was the moment the illusion shattered. Hannah had thought this man stepped in because he cared from the start, like a movie rescue. But the truth began colder and farther away. An old debt file, an intervention to protect order and reduce risk, and only after that, did it shift into something closer, concern for a specific person. A person with eyes that had learned not to beg anyone for pity. Hannah stood very still, tears rising but not falling loudly, sliding down like something held back too long. She hurt because she'd been pulled into a family tragedy she never chose, and she felt lighter because the invisible pieces finally had names, because the worst thing isn't an ugly truth. The worst thing is living inside a question with no answer. She said quietly that she hated her life being decided by debts she never signed. Graham said he hated that too, and that was why he wanted to end it without turning her into proof for anyone's pride. Just as the air in the room began to settle, Graham's phone buzzed. He checked the screen and put it on speaker. Sienna's voice came through fast and decisive. "I've got new information. We've gathered enough to pressure Calder to step back. Financial pressure plus federal risk has made them reconsider, but they'll only retreat if they get a closing statement that fits their rules, not an apology. A final line that lets them keep face." And Hannah felt her heart tighten again, because she understood the truth had been spoken. But the war wasn't over. It had only shifted into a final chapter, where she would have to choose how to close this door without becoming the price one more time. After Sienna's call, Graham didn't turn it into a celebration. He simply folded his laptop shut the way you fold a case file, then looked at Hannah with calm seriousness, and said they would end this in a way that left Calder with no benefit in dragging it out. Hannah thought the closing statement would be another stage. Another moment where she had to appear to serve someone else's face. But Sienna arrived with a different plan, clean and cold in the language of business. No emotion, no possessive promises of protection, only risk. They drafted a statement in the form of a legal and commercial notice, sent through a channel Calder was forced to answer. In it, Graham didn't say Hannah belonged to him. He didn't say he saved her out of affection. He didn't turn her into a trophy for his power. He simply confirmed that any transaction, any contract tied to Trent, and any party attempting to use Hannah as collateral would be treated as harassment and unlawful interference, and if it continued, it would trigger deeper audits, freezes on intermediary accounts, and heightened risk of attention from financial investigative authorities. Sienna added clear deadlines, clauses listing what evidence had been gathered, that the deleted footage showed signs of professional service-level interference, and that the address leak had been preserved as evidence, making it impossible for anyone to keep pushing without understanding. They were stepping into a danger zone that wasn't worth the cost. No sentence mentioned love. No sentence preached dignity like a speech. Yet that very coldness was exactly what Calder understood, because it spoke in the only language that mattered to them: price. Hannah read the draft and felt a strange release, because for the first time, her existence appeared in a document as a person with rights, not a commodity being transferred. When the notice went out, they didn't wait long, not because Calder was weak, but because Calder was smart enough to know when to retreat to protect itself. A short call came in. It wasn't Wesley Calder's voice. It was a cold representative confirming they accepted termination of the dispute, withdrew all related demands, and considered the matter closed. No apology, but no further requirement either. Hannah didn't exhale right away. She was used to every ending carrying a hook, but Graham looked at her and said this was how they withdrew to keep themselves clean, which meant that at least for now, they wouldn't come back unless they were willing to burn their own system. Sienna immediately shifted focus to Trent, because when Calder steps back, the pawn left behind panics, and a panicked man makes mistakes. She filed for an emergency protective order based on the footage from the event, added the messages and the pattern of litigation harassment, and this time the judge signed faster, because Trent's behavior was clear and recent. It wasn't a one-sided story anymore. Trent was barred from contacting her directly or indirectly, ordered to keep distance, and any violation would carry criminal consequences. But Trent wasn't the kind of man who loses by retreating politely. He tried to slip around it, tried to send people to pass messages, tried to text from unknown numbers, and that recklessness was where he lost his footing. A separate investigation that had been simmering around Trent, gambling and financial fraud, suddenly accelerated as accounts were audited and abnormal transactions surfaced in sharper relief, as if when the light hits the right angle, the stains have nowhere left to hide. The day they brought Trent to court to address the protective order violation and the related charges, Hannah didn't want to go. She wanted to close the door and let the attorneys do the rest. But Sienna said there are moments when a victim's presence isn't about asking for pity. It's about confirming the boundary, looking at the person who tried to define you, and delivering a final line. Hannah walked into the courthouse with cold hands, but her back straight. Graham remained a silent perimeter, granting her the air to breathe and the floor to own. The courthouse hallway smelled like paper and metal. Footsteps cracked sharp. Nothing was beautiful the way the penthouse was, but it was real, and Hannah felt like she was standing on ground, not glass. Trent was brought out with handcuffs on, the detainee uniform making him look slightly smaller, but his eyes still tried to hold on to the old hunger of pride, as if he believed he could still manipulate with a stare. When he saw Hannah, his mouth twitched into a smile, trying to throw her a reminder that he'd once been able to touch her, but Hannah didn't wobble anymore. She stepped close enough for him to hear, not close enough to violate the order, and her voice wasn't as shaky as she expected. It was strangely calm, like a voice that had walked through storms and learned how to stand. "You don't get to define me. No spite. No curse. Just one sentence of freedom." For a split second, Trent looked like he'd been slapped without anyone touching him, because he lived by turning people into the versions he wanted, and that line cut the power at the root. He gave a bitter little laugh and tried to claw back the upper hand by tossing one last hook, low enough that only she could hear. "You think this is over. Your father's debt is still there. Hannah, it'll come back." And in that sentence was a poisonous promise that he would always look for a string to pull. Hannah felt a sharp ache in her chest, but she didn't let it show on her face. She held his gaze one more second, then turned away, because she understood this was the soft cliffhanger of her life, a shadow not fully gone yet, but it no longer had the power to cover the light she'd switched on herself. When the courtroom door closed behind Trent, Sienna said quietly that this time he wouldn't slip away, because violating a protective order plus gambling fraud wasn't a threat made in the dark. It was a case file with evidence. And Hannah stepped into the hallway, drew a deep breath, and felt that justice sometimes isn't loud. Sometimes it's simply the fact that the men who once treated others like disposable property are finally pulled into the light by the very things they despised: law, truth, and a woman who has learned how to say no without asking permission. A few weeks after the court hearing, once the legal process had settled into motion and Hannah's breathing no longer snapped tight every time her phone screen lit up, she chose to return to a place that had once made her feel small. Not the penthouse or the courthouse, but a small gathering Madeline hosted in the familiar upper-class space, this time arranged like a safe room with a limited guest list. Controlled entry, clearly recording cameras, and everyone present aware that the single purpose was respecting boundaries. Hannah stepped through the door with hands slightly cold but a heart no longer running, because the biggest difference wasn't the room, it was the way she entered it. She walked in by her own choice instead of being dragged. She stood exactly where she wanted to stand instead of being pushed into a corner. She knew that if she wanted to leave, she could leave without asking permission from anyone. Madeline came up to her, her face serious, no longer wearing the half-apology of someone afraid of scandal. She looked Hannah in the eye and apologized for real, not excusing herself by saying she was scared, not saying she didn't know, not blaming circumstances. She only said she was wrong to stay silent. She was wrong to let a woman be humiliated and not stand up. She would live with that lesson for the rest of her life. Hannah heard that apology and felt a knot in her chest loosen, because sometimes healing isn't forgetting. Sometimes it is being acknowledged that what you lived through was real and you didn't deserve it. During the gathering, Hannah didn't retell the old scene. She didn't repeat Trent's name at length. She only spoke briefly about boundaries and self-determination, about how no one has the right to touch another person's body or life. And if someone says no, then it is no. No reasons required, no explanations owed. She emphasized that what changed wasn't that she became strong like a legend. What changed was that she learned to say one clear sentence and let the truth be verified by cameras and witnesses, because the new truth no longer depended on whether people wanted to believe it. The truth was recorded, confirmed, and respected. Graham stood in a corner of the room, not taking the spotlight, not speaking for her, not turning this moment into a story about his power. He was only there as a quiet boundary, exactly as he had promised, and Hannah felt a strange peace when she saw it, that sometimes love and protection aren't about gripping tight. Sometimes they are about standing in the right place so the other person can stand on her own. When the gathering ended, Hannah stepped outside. The night wind felt cooler. The city was still loud, but it no longer swallowed her. She put a hand to her chest as if checking her heartbeat, and realized something simple she once believed she would never have again. She felt herself coming home inside her own body. Not an apartment, Not a secret address, but the feeling of belonging to herself, living without asking fear for permission. But life doesn't close like a movie with only one ending. A few days later, while Hannah was making tea in the penthouse kitchen and trying to focus on small routines to feed her peace, Keating brought up an envelope delivered through traditional mail. No luxury logo, only the stamp of an old debt recovery office. Hannah opened it. Her hand didn't shake the way it used to, but her heart still pinched when she saw her father's name on the paper, and a dry line stating the file had been reopened. In that moment, the shadow Trent had thrown at her in the courthouse hallway slid through again like a cold draft, but Hannah didn't collapse. She lifted her eyes to Graham and Sienna standing there, then looked back at the letter the way you look at a problem to be solved, not a curse. She understood a new test might be coming, that the past might knock again, but now she had a voice, and she had choices, and she would not let anyone define her by someone else's debt. The human lesson of this story is that silence is never safety for the harmed person. Boundaries aren't coldness. They're a basic right, and justice sometimes begins with a short sentence spoken at the right moment, together with the courage of people willing to stand on the side of truth. If you're listening to this story and you see yourself, or someone you love, inside it, remember you're not alone, you deserve respect, and you have the right to seek help from safe, legal, trustworthy sources. If this story touched your emotions, please hit like and share to spread the message about boundaries and respect. And subscribe to our channel so every day you can watch more videos that are engaging, emotional, and meaningful. How did this story make you feel? And how do you connect it to real life? Please leave a comment. We truly want to hear what's in your heart. Hello, and see you again in the next video. Wishing everyone watching good health, a joyful life, peace every day. Goodbye, and see you again in the next video.